Hi, this is Bobby Rodriguez, the K-12 Social Studies Coordinator. So, now that we understand where our district is in the process, we need to think about what assessment means to us within the UbD framework. And just as important, we should be aware of the value of the existing assessments we already use in our classrooms. Often, we as teachers think like lesson planners, which feels like a full-time job. We consider which activities will be interesting and engaging, what resources we have, the time constraints for our unit, and how many grades we need. But we don't often stop to think like assessors, even though we really need to. Because if we don't think ahead about the desired results of our curriculum when we plan to assess, we might get some grades and some information, like who scored a 90% and who scored 50%, but we won't really know if our students have mastered the entirety of the understandings we were targeting in our unit. To think like an assessor, we need to think ahead of time about the standards and what kind of evidence might give us insight into whether or not a student has mastered them. We've got to be careful that it isn't likely for a student to do well on our assessment, but really lack a deep understanding of the content. Conversely, we should be sure that it isn't possible that a student might do poorly on our assessment while nevertheless having a well-developed understanding of the unit. I'm looking at you, art projects masquerading as assessments. Look at your handout titled Collecting Diverse Evidence from Assessments. And for another perspective, also look over the classroom assessment page that shows assessment for and assessment of learning. You can see that there really is a continuum of forms of assessment that happen in our classroom, and we should take a moment to recognize the value in all of them. No one here is telling you to throw out all of the unit tests and quizzes, because just as our students need to build their knowledge step by step, we can build our understanding of how they're doing step by step. It's helpful to think of moving away from a snapshot, a one-day picture of a particular set of knowledge or skills, and move towards building a figurative scrapbook of each student's growing understanding. So, what can these different forms of assessments tell us? Well, the everyday questions, activities, and conversations you have in your classroom give everyone, students and teachers, feedback about how a particular lesson is going. Assuming that the lesson was well tied to the enduring understandings, knowledge, and skills called for by the standards, the feedback will give teachers good information about how to modify instruction to ensure students are on track for learning. That said, these kinds of checks are necessarily brief and public, which makes it difficult to get a detailed understanding of where each student stands. Our normal tests and quizzes, matching, multiple choice, fill in the blank, and short answer, do two things really well. First, they help us assess discrete content knowledge. Do they know these words? Do they know how to compute a particular answer? And so on. And second, they're easy and quick to grade, which allows us to respond quickly if needed. On the other hand, they don't do as well at helping us to see if a student really understands a concept. A student might get an A by being good at memorizing, for example, but still really struggle to apply or synthesize their knowledge to something they can use outside of the academic setting. Academic prompts, like essays or long-form problem solving, help us to assess higher-level thinking skills. And that's a good thing. But we can't, realistically or in good conscience, ask for essays to assess every little piece of our standards. That would take too long and would also drown us in grading. And additionally, there remains the drawback of focusing entirely on the content in isolation of the real world. If what we want is understanding that students can transfer, we're still missing something if we stop our assessment continuum here. So that's where we get to performance assessments. Erin will talk about this more in the next session, but suffice to say for now that there is a final, more authentic way to judge whether students have developed real understandings for transfer. If we give students a real or simulated scenario that asks them to apply their knowledge and use their understanding to craft some kind of product or performance, don't panic, We mean performance in the most general possible sense, no stages required. If we do this, then we're in a much better position to evaluate their understanding of the concept at the highest level. But do we still need the other kinds of assessments? Absolutely yes. It would be unwieldy at best and more likely impossible to create a performance task that simultaneously assesses understanding and also all of the discrete knowledge and skills that are the building blocks for that understanding. If we used only performance tasks, we might know who got it at the highest levels, but for everyone who fell short, we'd be at a loss to know where the problem was. Did they not understand the vocabulary? Not know how to use the skills? Know it all but have trouble transferring it to a new situation? You can see, all of these kinds of assessments have advantages and limitations, so we need them all in their own settings. Our goal today is to introduce you to, or remind you about, the role that performance assessments should play in gathering information about your students' curriculum mastery. I'll let the developers of UbD speak for themselves here. They say, too often as teachers, we rely on only one or two types of assessment, and then compound that error by concentrating on those aspects of the curriculum that are most easily tested and graded. On the other hand, it is a common misconception that reform is about an exclusive reliance on authentic assessments. For evidence of many desired results, especially discrete knowledge and skill, objective quizzes, tests, and observations with checklists often suffice. Altogether, we have to broaden our thinking process as teachers to include thinking like an assessor. What is it that we're trying to assess? General background information? Is it specific knowledge? Is it a discrete skill? Or is it a core understanding that we want them to be able to transfer outside of our classroom? Each of these needs to be assessed, but we can't assess them all in the same ways. And if we try to use one form of assessment to evaluate them all, we're going to be missing something important. So let me be clear. Performance assessments will not replace all regular classroom assessment. They won't cover every piece of every unit. You'll still need to evaluate your students' mastery of some concepts in other ways. But without a performance assessment, you won't have the complete picture of your students' understanding. So let's return to the example about making a bed. You already brainstormed the required knowledge, skills, and understandings that we'd hope students would be able to master at the end of our lessons on bed making. After this video, you'll discuss with your team how well you could gather knowledge of mastery with each of the forms of assessment we've discussed, like checks for understanding, knowledge and skills assessments or regular tests, and academic prompts like essays. Then, take a moment to consider, what would you still not really know about a student's mastery of bed making if you only used those kinds of assessments? What would be left? Now, take time to discuss, and when you're finished, move on to the next video.